Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. On this episode of Writers at Work, I'll be speaking with Ruth D Nelson, art historian and author of the new Our Lady of the World's Fair, bringing Michelangelo's Pieta to Queens in 1964. Make no mistake, Nelson's book is a work of serious scholarship, but it is also a tale of intrigue and suspense as mighty forces struggle to bring or to prevent the export of the Pieta to America. With a deft, confident hand, Nelson introduces us to the major players like Robert Moses, Pope John XXIII, various members of the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church in the U.S. and at the Vatican, and American and Italian business leaders. But there are countless unsung heroes of the saga, and by showing us their contributions, Nelson reveals what a complex operation it was. And then there is the matter of Michelangelo, who created the Pieta before he turned 25. We learn how he came to receive the assignment and what he thought of his masterpiece. We know now, some 6 decades later, that the Pieta arrived and departed safely and intact. So how did Nelson create her tale of suspense? That's a point we'll discuss. Ruth D Nelson, welcome to Writers at Work.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Now tell us a little bit about your background as an art historian.
Well, after working various jobs, I felt like I even had a calling to go back and to academia to study art history. And I got my master's at University of Illinois at Chicago, but I was very interested in American art and Renaissance art. And so that's what eventually led me to my topic.
Right. When did you become interested in the Pieta in particular and its journey to New York?
Well, I first became interested with my first class in the master's program on Renaissance art. And we looked at Michelangelo and the Pietà, and I'm giving away my age. As a child, I remember going to the World's Fair and seeing the Pietà. So, but just vaguely, but I thought, there's a story there. How did that happen? So it took me a number of years, but I finally got going on the project, and here we are.
So that's how it begins, now with a question.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. At what point did you consider writing a book? I mean, did you think you were going to do articles? It was what, more than a decade since
Oh, more. Yes.
of your previous book on the Jesuit missionary Marquette. So
Yes.
you had a big gap of a decade. Were you writing all along, or were you pondering all along? Or?
I was pondering all along. And my sister lives in the New York area out in White Plains. And when I visited her once, I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to the Queen's Museum and see what they have in the archives. And so my interest did not diminish, it just kept growing. So then, after the experience with my first book, I thought, you know what? I really need a book agent. So I had a proposal all ready to go, and then I started looking for a book agent. And I came upon Rita Rosencrantz, who was wonderful. And she liked the topic. There were plenty who had no interest in this topic, but she saw there was some potential in it. So that's when I started to work on it in earnest. And that was maybe 2016, 2017.
As you began, what did you see as the heart of the story? Was it the behind the scenes machinations, the transportation of the sculpture, its reception? I mean, what was going to be the engine that drove the rest of the narrative?
It was the behind the scenes negotiations. And that's the one area that was the hardest really to get to the bottom of. I had access to the archives at the Archdiocesan Archives of New York. I visited them before COVID. They were closed, and after COVID. Then access to the Brooklyn Diocesan Archives, and that was really the gold mine. But the one archives I didn't have access to were at the Vatican. And that's because this is how the library functions. They work through one pontificate at a time. And because of the questions about Pius XII's involvement in World War II, working with the Jews, they skipped some pontificates, or maybe just one, to start examining his papers to address these questions that were out there. So the period that I was most interested in was the pontificate of Pope John XXIII, because he is the Pope that gave permission for the loan. But those had, and then also to his successor, Pope Paul VI. I got to always think to make sure I get my numbers right. So really, Pope Paul VI, starting then, they are not available. They haven't opened those up yet. So I just tried the best I could from the sources that I had.
Well, I must say that I don't sense anything is missing, Ruth, in your storytelling. I mean, it's encyclopedic, and particularly the negotiations with the Vatican. I think you've captured that beautifully. At any rate, those who know the history of the World's Fair, I guess, are aware of the role of Robert Moses, perhaps the most powerful New Yorker of his time and the president of the World's Fair Corporation. Did your impression of Moses change as you did your research?
Well, yes, it did, because the general consensus, but see, I'm not from New York. I have lived in New York for a short time, but I was not aware of Robert Moses then. The consensus is maybe that on balance, he did more harm than good. But when I looked closer, I thought, well, yeah, I'm not so sure. And there are architects out there, architectural historians and urban planning historians who are taking a new look at Moses, and he's being somewhat rehabilitated in some quarters.
You know,
And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it comes through in your storytelling that you don't see him as a villain.
I really don't. But I wasn't living in New York. I don't have any personal memory of him. So I'm a little cautious, but I do see the good that he did.
Yeah,
And
you read Robert Caro's books,
not the complete book, Power Broker,
right?
but I did read a good part of it.
Yeah.
So, and even there, actually, and I've heard him acknowledge this, that he did not write all bad things about Moses. He also covered the good, but it gets overshadowed by those people really who had more experience with him than a lot of other readers. And so yeah, so I gravitated more to, well, what was the positive what was the good that he contributed to New
Yeah.
York?
No, that is refreshing aspect of your book, the sort of repositioning of Robert Moses. Cardinal Spellman is a somewhat forgotten figure. But he was such a major player in his time, and as much as anyone, he was perfectly positioned between the interests of the church and the fair, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I would. And he is another one of those figures that this is the thing that surprised me even today, working with my editor. Uh, First, his reaction to what I wrote about Robert Moses, and then I had a reader who was steeped in New York Catholic history as it's just he was a writer during this period of Spellman's tenure, and I was surprised by the reactions still
Really?
to this day. And so within certain circles of uh, the Catholic community in New York, Spellman is like Robert Moses. So, but not coming from New York, I saw him with in a different light. I saw again all the good that he had done. And initially, he wasn't really keen on taking on this project of building a pavilion for the World's Fair. Now, there was a pavilion. The first time the Vatican participated in a World's Fair was in Brussels in 1958. That was very successful. However, the burden did not fall on one particular location. Like the cardinal in Belgium didn't have to foot the entire bill. It was shared among Catholic European countries, or the church in those countries. But here, for New York, Spellman would have to carry the entire financial burden of the pavilion. And it's not that he couldn't, but he just saw more important projects out there, like hospitals and huge Catholic charities uh, contributor. So all of these things running the diocese to him were more important. But the idea started to be floated around uh, between Moses and Spellman that, well, Moses wanted a blockbuster. He wanted a blockbuster for the fair because, frankly, fairs don't often make money. They rarely turn a profit. So he thought, well wow, if we could get a, a blockbuster, a masterpiece from the Vatican, and we have that in the Vatican Pavilion, that would be just super. So he leaned on Spellman. But then when the idea came up to have the Pietà as the blockbuster, then it's my personal opinion that it was such an audacious choice that Spellman was drawn to it. So I have read, not officially, that when the Pope decided, yes, we should have a Vatican pavilion at the New York World's Fair, Spellman, it has been, I have read it that he said, well, here's the deal. If you loan us the Pietà, I will build your pavilion. So that is pretty much how it probably evolved. And
So,
then, go
uh,
ahead.
no. I was as an author. Now you have two of the main characters of the story who you are discovering are different, at least to your perception, than the general consensus. Uh,
Correct.
did that send you down a different path in terms of your storytelling?
Not really, because I was open to that from the start.
Hmm.
I was open to that. Uh, I honestly, I mean, what surprised me was that Spellman was not fully on board right away. And it also surprised me that Moses didn't have the fear. The, the fear was not an end in and of itself. It was a means for Moses to turn Flushing Meadows into the #1 super park of New York. And he needed money for that. He started it with the first New York World's Fair in 1939, but he couldn't fully realize his dream for that park until the idea grew to have a second fair, and he jumped on that. Oh, this is my opportunity to complete this project of turning the park into a dream park. But so once he decided, yes, the World's Fair is the way to go to realize my dream, he was fully on board. So both Moses and Spellman both, well, they had their own objectives, but they came together and they already had something of an alliance.
Right.
Being fixtures in they were two power centers in New York.
And
So
they both love to build.
exactly, they were both builders.
You know, Ruth, there are so many provocative gems in your narrative that I had no idea about. So I'm just going to list a few, okay?
Okay.
For example, there were no works by Michelangelo in America at the time. The Mona Lisa was on display in Washington and New York in early 1963. The Met had a full-size plaster cast of the Pietà in a warehouse in New York.
Yes.
All the fingers on the figure of the Virgin Mary in Michelangelo's sculpture had been broken at one time or another.
Yes.
There was a thought to shipping the Pietà to New York via submarine,
Yes.
and so on and so on and so on. Um, I have the impression of like a light bulb going off over your head, or like little fireworks in the sky every time you come across one of these gems. I just find they so enliven the story, and you handle them very well. You kind of sneak them in there at sometimes.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, there are these little gems. I thank you for calling them that. There was even a suggestion they should ship it on the plane. But I just want to follow up on one of those points.
Right.
They decided on the ship because another thing is that this was the dawn of the use of styrofoam. It's like today we just like, oh, styrofoam, hasn't that been around forever? No, it wasn't. So it was really the early 60s. And because of that material used to pack the crate, even if the ship sunk, the crate with the Pietà in it would float. So over time,
Amazing.
now that the book is out, I'm hearing all these stories of people's remembrances. And a priest in Monroe, New York, called David Ryder, has a parishioner. And he and his wife were immigrants to America, and they came over on the same ship
Ah,
as the Pietà. And he told the priest that among the Italians, because there were other Italian immigrants coming over, among the Italians, he said, well, and without any irony, we're advised if the ship sinks, hold on to Mary.
ah,
And the priest said to him, Giovanni, do you know what you just said? So it's just a real interesting allegory for those who have a devotion to Mary, that even this thought of holding on to the crate, first of all, is pretty remarkable, but also this double meaning of looking to Mary for protection.
right, right. The idea that the Pieta could float, though, is a little mind-boggling.
It
Don't you
is.
think? I don't know, how much does it weigh? I forget. Did you mention that? How much it
Oh,
weighs? But
I'm
it,
sorry, I forget too, but
yeah, it's unlikely that it, on its own it could float. And
oh yes,
I think
right.
you very subtly you get across the point that if a plane crashed, the sculpture would likely be destroyed, but if the ship sank, it could be found and salvaged.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, this is the level of detail in terms of logistics that you communicate, and I think that that's one way you create suspense is by detailing the sort of nerve-wracking task of logistics. You just alluded to the packing and the shipping of it. And what you do is you drive us into the room where those decisions are being made. Um, Forgive my ignorance about this, but is an art historian expected to be an expert on such details as packing material and whether straw is superior to styrofoam, or what kind of beacon could reveal where the sculpture is if it sank? I mean, it seems to me that this is ancillary at best
Well,
to
yes, yes, but it does come up in art history, and I'll tell you why, because you could get a PhD in art history and you'd still have a problem finding a job. But if you go into museum studies, you might have a better chance. So, museum studies and art history are linked, and the packing of artwork is tangential to the study of art. You don't have to go that direction, but I was kind of led in that direction. Started with the plaster casts, actually, uh, because uh, the Metropolitan Museum is actually bringing back a lot of its plaster casts because uh, a lot of people, they, especially back then, didn't have the chance to travel to see
hmm,
the originals, but they could with the plaster cast. So that ties in the museum again, how it plays a role in the study of art, but really how to bring it to people here in this country over time. The
yeah,
history of museums, museology.
yeah.
But oh,
No, no, no.
but
I'm thinking
the,
of something you mentioned earlier, and that um, the Vatican Library can be impenetrable. But was the Met cooperative?
oh yes, oh yes, and the Vatican would have also been receptive. There is a procedure to go through because there are plenty of scholars that do their study at the Vatican Library, but it's a process.
Hmm.
It's a process. Um, but what else was I thinking when you mentioned that? Um,
Muse museology? Was that the term you used?
Museology,
Yeah,
yes,
museology. Yeah, yeah.
yes.
And
But
what kind of answer parallel expertise one needs?
oh, exactly, right,
Yeah.
right. But the other thing I wanted to bring up, okay, there is this uh, tension about shipping the Pietà, but the other point that surprised me was how much tension was involved in receiving the Pope for the first time, and how it uh, almost shut down the city. And the fact that, oh, he's going to the United Nations, well, we have to really be on our guard because look what happened to Che Guevara when there were Cubans trying to uh, disrupt or maybe even target him from across the river. So all of the preparations, it almost is like it almost, I didn't think of it before, but it almost parallels the shipment of the Pietà, all of the groundwork and the preparation that was required for the first time ever visit of a pope.
Right. You know, as I've said this already, I've enjoyed your book very much, Ruth. And you again, you do this very subtly, which I really appreciated it. You know, I don't remember this. I attended the World's Fair several times, but I don't recall that there were other great historical artifacts on display. You tell us that the Dead Sea Scrolls were there, that the Russian Orthodox icon Our Lady of
Mhm.
Kazan from the 15th century was there. Original copies of the Bill of Rights and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the Gutenberg Bible, a 700-year-old bronze bodhisattva from Nepal, and of course the sculpture of the Good Shepherd from the 3rd
Mhm.
century. Um, I don't remember any of those things, Ruth. And but everyone remembers that the Pietà was there. And as you point out, the Vatican Pavilion was the second most popular at the fair, and through its gift shop, um, it was highly profitable.
Mhm.
So as you were writing the book, what did what made this exhibition far more popular than others that had these dynamic historical figures?
Well, that is a really good question. Um, it could be that there were so many objections to the shipment of the Pietà. For one, um, second, it was promoted very much so by Robert Moses, and of course, uh, Spellman. Not only in New York, well, Spellman would send the word out to everybody, especially on the East Coast. I haven't really thought of that, but that is so true. Um, and the funny thing is, I don't remember if I mentioned it in my book or not. Uh, when I was working on this, one of my coworkers who was in her 20s and she had an art degree, and she asked me, "Well, what are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, well, you know Michelangelo's Pietà." And she said, "No, I don't." So I thought about that. That just because we knew it, well, maybe so many of our generation knows it because of the fair, because we went to the fair, but it is lost now for younger generations,
Yeah.
for many in the so it must have been really a thing. I don't remember uh the promotions. Yeah, I was out of state anyway in Chicago, but uh that is a really good point, why how the other great works really didn't get
Mm.
spotlighted the way the Pietà did.
So as you're writing your book, did you have concerns that the fair was an abstraction for most readers?
Well, that that I maybe not consciously, but for many, since we haven't had a World's Fair in America since 1984, so it would be harder for younger generations to kind of imagine what this would be like. And there are younger scholars, though, who are trying to pull the US back into the World's Fair business, because right now it's being picked up by China.
Mm.
Yes, so and we're losing opportunities, diplomatic opportunity. Just so much can come out of a fair, uh, design-wise, architecturally, culturally, technologically. So they are generators of a lot of new ideas and markers also to look back on
Hmm.
uh, over the decades. I'm not sure if that answers the question,
No,
but
no, no. I mean, you know, I one of the reasons I enjoyed your book, Ruth, so much is that I feel there is a lack of a definitive document about the fair.
mhm,
If you go on YouTube, you can't find a really excellent documentary about the
mhm,
fair.
mhm.
And maybe I just haven't seen it or read it. But to me, it's unimaginable that such a vast and influential undertaking wouldn't be so thoroughly documented.
Yes.
I mean, when you go on YouTube and you want to learn about the 1964 World's Fair, more than likely you're going to come across someone's home movie.
Yes, that's so true.
And what you've given us here now through the prism of one pavilion is a broader view of I mean, you mentioned that there's 140 pavilions representing 80 countries, 24 US states, 45 corporations. In your research, did you come across any reason why no one thought to make a definitive documentary about the fair?
No,
I
but
mean,
what I
where was Ken Burns when we needed
I
him?
know. Wow, this would be a great topic for him. But what I did come across are scholars writing in academic journals, maybe focusing on one particular pavilion. So they are uh, uh, they're taking one thread of this huge fair and digging deeper, like kind of like what I did with the Vatican Pavilion, uh, but not in book form, but maybe a journal article, like taking a closer examination of uh, the Florida Pavilion or the
Right.
design of the Wisconsin Pavilion. Uh, and I like that. I like that they're going back uh, to study it. And you basically, and I think I mentioned this, World's Fairs are like petri dishes of our
Right.
culture or a snapshot of our culture at that time. And they can be very fascinating and lead to deeper discussions on our society. And so it's time. You're right, Jim. It's time.
It's time.
Yeah.
You're as you demonstrate through your treatment of Moses and Spellman, you're even-handed throughout in your narrative. Um, you have that discipline as an author, but occasionally you get rankled a little bit at the critics here and in Rome and how they reviewed the exhibition. I mean, criticism of the idea of loaning the Pietà began as soon as the word leaked.
Yes.
Far be it from me to chide critics, but most of them were wrong, weren't they?
Yes. They were all wrong because the Americans took such great care and research into packaging the Pietà. I do acknowledge that Italians or any tourists that go to the Vatican would be expecting to see the real Pietà, and so many Italians ask, well, why don't they were going to see a replica at
Right,
St. Peter's?
right,
So many asked, well, why don't you leave the original here and send the replica to New York?
right.
There is some logic there, but that wasn't the deal that was made.
Yeah, I have to say I'm a big fan of Pope John the 23rd. I think he's
Uh,
a latter day hero who is overlooked. But subtly, you very often remind us that the Roman Catholic Church is a political body as well. So to have a plaster cast of the Pietà would not have achieved what the Vatican wanted to achieve, which was to uh, reaffirm or reestablish its presence in America.
so true. So
Yeah,
that is very beautifully put, Jim.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, they that I couldn't say that I couldn't have said that better.
Thank you. You know, Ruth, I have to tell you that you shocked me at one point in your book when you told me that Pope Paul VI considered selling the Pietà. I had no idea. I
Yes.
had no idea.
Yes, I mean, it was shocking for me to read that. Just this wasn't even part of my research. I had just come across that in reading up for an art history class, but it did speak to his concern about addressing the issue of world poverty.
Right.
But wow, I'm so glad he didn't do that.
No, me too. You know, Ruth, I admire in large nonfiction works like this is somebody like me who's my novels aside, you know, I wrote about 600, 800 word columns.
Hmm.
So, you know, I once I started, I knew where I was going and I'd get there. When I was reading your book, about 20 times I thought, oh my God, if I had found this fact, it would have hijacked the entire book. You know, I would have led with this, you know, I would have,
Oh.
and I sort of admire that even-handedness of these sort of big academic slash commercial endeavors for staying true to the course.
Mhm.
You know? Anyway, have you ever seen the Pietà in person?
Yes, I have. I have been to St. Peter's, and it is beautiful. It is beautiful. So, but Jim, I know you mentioned you're writing a novel at the Vatican, and I am really looking forward to reading that book.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to every other people reading it too, Ruth.
Yeah.
It's been such a struggle.
Oh, oh.
But did you have an emotional attachment to the Pietà? Did it inform your narrative? I mean, it is a very moving piece of art.
It is, and it did inspire me to some degree. The beauty and the deep pathos that Michelangelo was able to, I mean, just the technical skill, but also he was so devoted uh, to Mary and Christ that that love also came through in this beauty. It's actually a mother child uh,
Correct.
a sculpture, and that hit me when I was researching the history, and I thought, wow, I never thought of it quite in those terms, but yes, the love uh, that it displays.
But what we also have to get again where faith and commerce intersect. We know that Michelangelo signed the Pietà that
Yes,
because there was rumor that someone else had created it.
yes, and that is a great story. He had overheard that immediately, it would draw crowds immediately. And he went and heard some pilgrims from another part of Italy uh, discussing the piece, and it was done by their sculptor from up where they were from, and that enraged him so much that he went once everyone left, engraved his name across the strap, uh, crossing Mary's chest, and afterward, he was ashamed of himself because usually, if you make something to honor God, you don't sign your
Yes.
name
Right.
back
Right.
then. Yeah, today it's a very different story, but
Right. You know, Ruth, I could talk for hours about your book. You know, I love the subject of the World's Fair. I love the subject of the Vatican Pavilion. And to be frank, I thought I'm only going to be disappointed by this book because it could not match my expectations. And you did, Ruth. You've done a wonderful job, and I thank you so much for your book.
well, I thank you, Jim. I'm so actually I went through a lot. I went through a lot, And my original editor didn't like the direction I was going on, but then he left and had got a great new job somewhere else, and the new editor did appreciate he was fine with me going with my approach. So it was a struggle for me, so it's so gratifying to hear your comments,
No,
Jim. I appreciate it so much.
well, thank you for sticking with it. I've been speaking with Ruth D Nelson, author of Our Lady of the World's Fair, bringing Michelangelo's Pieta to Queens in 1964. Ruth, thanks so much for joining me on Writers at Work.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Jim.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusili. Until next time, happy reading.